Welcome to Dreamy Old Stories. Here we tell slow and gentle tales from history. Stories that calm your mind and help you fall asleep. If you enjoy the journey, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin tonight's dreamy story. As always, history is full of irony. Some of the richest, most powerful rulers were utterly obsessed with their mortality, preparing elaborate rituals that sometimes outlived them, in ways both impressive and mildly ridiculous. Pharaohs of Egypt, eternity by brick and gold. Let's begin with the Egyptians. The pharaohs were obsessed with immortality, and the pyramids were the ultimate proof of that obsession. These weren't just tombs. They were cosmic elevators designed to lift the deceased king into the heavens. Inside, walls were decorated with spells from the Book of the Dead, instructions for navigating the afterlife. The pharaohs were buried with jewelry, furniture, food, servants, and occasionally unfortunate animals or humans, though later traditions replaced people with statues. All this to ensure that they didn't starve or get lost after death. The ironic part, despite these monumental efforts, tombs were regularly looted. Thousands of years of preparation, all for the occasional grave robber with a keen eye for gold. And yet, the pharaoh's obsession with death gave us the most enduring monuments of the ancient world. Sleep, for them, was a lifelong rehearsal for eternity. The curse of Tutankhamun, marketing or mystery. Tutankhamun, the boy king. He died young, was buried in a relatively modest tomb, and somehow became the poster child for deadly curses. When Howard Carter opened his tomb in 1922, several people associated with the discovery died unexpectedly. The press called it a curse. Scholars called it coincidence. The reality, most likely bacterial contamination or sheer bad luck. Still, the idea of a curse captured the imagination. The perfect mix of fear, mystery, and headline-grabbing drama. Whether it was marketing, myth, or actual mummies fighting back, it illustrates a key point, even in death. Royals inspired obsession, fear, and superstition. European royals, elaborate funerals, and slightly ridiculous preparations moved north to medieval Europe, where kings and queens had an entirely different approach. Death was public theater. Funerals lasted days, even weeks. Bodies were displayed, relics paraded, and ceremonies performed with extreme formality. Take King Henry VIII of England. He was buried with an air of pomp that even he might have found exhausting. His tomb in St. George's Chapel, Windsor, is ornate, massive, and designed to impress. A statement that even in death, he was unmissable. Or Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, who arranged his tomb so carefully that it survived decades of political turmoil, only to be dismantled during the French Revolution. All that effort gone, but the memory of his grandeur lingered, and the story itself became part of his enduring legend. Mummies, wax figures, and false body. Some royals went to extremes in preparation for the afterlife. In Napoleon's family, wax figures and effigies were sometimes used during funerals when the body was unavailable or difficult to transport. In the Holy Roman Empire, rulers were sometimes buried in multiple locations, hearts in one chapel, bodies in another, viscera in yet another. The goal, maximizing both religious propriety and posthumous prestige. It seems excessive, and it was, but it also gave a sort of continuity, a way for the living to honor and control the memory of the dead. Curses, tombs, and superstitions and superstitions. Not all rituals were about grandeur. Many included warnings, curses inscribed on tombs to ward off robbers, protective charms placed within burial chambers, secret passages to confuse intruders. Sometimes the curses worked, at least in legend. Sometimes they didn't. Either way, they show how fear of death extended far beyond the personal to the practical and even political. Funerary oddities around the world crossed the globe. Royals treated death with a mixture of reverence, obsession, and occasional absurdity. China, Ming emperors were buried in vast necropalaces, often with elaborate terracotta figures, replicas of palaces, and intricate ritual items. Some tombs included life-size servants made of clay. Africa. Some kingdoms mummified or preserved leaders with elaborate ceremonies, blending ancestral veneration with status. Japan. Emperors and nobles sometimes underwent elaborate cremation rituals with posthumous gifts and offerings at shrines. Even if some of these practices seem excessive to us, they all share the same goal: to manage death, control memory, and maintain authority beyond life. The oddities of European tombs in medieval and Renaissance Europe. Tombs weren't just for the dead. They were status symbols, political statements, and occasionally bizarre displays of wealth. Take Richard the Lionheart, for instance. He died far from home on a crusade, yet his body was divided for burial. His heart in one place, his body in another, his entrails elsewhere. It seems unnecessarily complicated and maybe slightly morbid, but it allowed multiple regions to claim connection to the king. A political move disguised as a mortuary ritual. Clever, if you don't mind the smell of embalming fluid. Then there's Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor, whose tomb is practically a museum. Figures of knights, angels, and mourning relatives crowd the marble in a dizzying display of devotion and ego. The irony is that while he spent decades securing power on earth, centuries later, historians and tourists are the only ones left to admire his elaborate vanity project. Some tombs included what we might now call practical jokes for the afterlife, secret doors to confuse, intruders' poisonous traps rarely used effectively, tombs designed so that those opening them might accidentally collapse a corridor. Sure, it sounds cruel, but in the medieval mind, it was an effective way to protect both body and reputation. Famous curses and superstitions. Royal tombs often came with warnings carved in stone. Pharaohs like Seti I included inscriptions threatening death or misfortune for any who disturbed the tomb. European nobles sometimes included Latin phrases implying divine punishment or eternal damnation. Some Chinese emperors had guards posted near tombs, sometimes for centuries, to protect against grave robbers. Of course, most curses were more psychological than mystical. People reading the inscriptions tended to stay away, partly from fear, partly from respect, and partly from the sheer hassle of moving tons of stone. But sometimes these warnings were taken seriously. Stories of explorers or tomb raiders dying after entering sacred spaces were often exaggerated into legend. And that's how cursed tombs became a favorite trope in literature and pop culture. Royal mummies and preservation. Some rulers took the preservation of their bodies to extremes. Egyptian pharaohs were, of course, famous for mummification. The process was long, meticulous, and occasionally involved removing organs, embalming with resin, and wrapping the body in hundreds of meters of linen. It seems excessive, but it ensured that the king would be recognizable for eternity. And maybe, just maybe, he could enjoy a little comfort in the afterlife, or at least impress passing spirits. In Incan Peru, mummies of emperors were treated almost as if they were still alive. They were seated on thrones, clothed in finery, and brought out for ceremonial purposes. It wasn't creepy at all, just an everyday way to maintain continuity between the living and the dead. Posthumous oddities around the world, other cultures had their own unusual approaches. Japan, some shoguns were interred in mausoleums with elaborate rituals, often involving multiple shrines and offerings. Africa, kings in some regions were buried with personal items, servant statues, or symbolic food to accompany them. Mesoamerica, Mayan and Aztec rulers sometimes included precious goods, jade masks, and even sacrificed attendants in their tombs. It's easy to focus on the strangeness, but these practices were deeply meaningful at the time, providing structure, honor, and reassurance to both the deceased and the living. Reflections on power and mortality. What's striking is the combination of vanity, fear, and reverence in royal burial practices. Powerful people could control armies, laws, and trade routes, but death remained untouchable. Their response? Control it symbolically, publicly, and elaborately. A king might be alive for decades, but his tomb ensured influence for centuries. And if he could scare a few grave robbers along the way, so much the better. Even the most extravagant tombs, full of gold, statues, and curses, are ultimately human. A quiet insistence that life mattered, that memory mattered, and that even in death, the king or queen had the final word. The weirdest royal burials, some royal burials, were less about solemnity and more about spectacle, ego, or just a touch of the bizarre. Take King Tutankhamun again. Yes, we mentioned him before, but his tomb is worth revisiting. The boy king's chamber was relatively small, yet packed with gold, jewelry, furniture, and chariots. Even his sandals were gilded. You can imagine the young king stepping into eternity thinking, "I'll need these." Then there's Ramses too, who had multiple tombs constructed for himself, presumably because one wasn't enough. Or Ptolemy I of Egypt, whose mummy was interred in a collective tomb with other royals, ensuring eternal company because solitude is overrated. Apparently, even in death, in Europe, we see similar extravagance. Charles I of England was executed, but his body was embalmed and parts were interred in different locations. His burial combined political symbolism with elaborate ritual, a reminder that even in death, a king's story could be controlled, shaped, and distributed. Some burials were downright theatrical. Isabella of Castile, for instance, had a tomb designed so that the effigy of her and her husband, Ferdinand, appeared to gaze at each other across the chamber. A romantic gesture frozen in marble hundreds of years in advance. It's touching, but also mildly impractical for anyone wanting to clean the tomb. Curses and warnings. Royal tombs often carried inscriptions, warning intruders of dire consequences. Egyptian pharaohs wrote explicit curses, threatening death, disease, or divine retribution. European nobles occasionally included Latin inscriptions implying eternal damnation for anyone disturbing their remains. Mayan and Aztec rulers relied on sacred placement, secret chambers, or even human sacrifice to protect their resting places. Some curses likely worked, not through magic, but through intimidation. Grave robbers, faced with massive stone doors, lethal traps, and ominous warnings, might think twice. And even when ignored, the stories lived on, giving birth to legends, ghost stories, and, eventually, modern cursed tomb tales. Preserving power beyond death, many royals believed their influence shouldn't end with death. Elaborate tombs, effigies, and rituals ensured their presence lingered, sometimes centuries after they were gone. Napoleon Bonaparte, though not ancient, had his body moved multiple times, ultimately resting in a grand tomb at Les Invalides in Paris. It's less about superstition, more about maintaining memory, legacy, and influence. Even in death, leaders wanted to control the narrative, to be remembered as powerful, important, and, in some cases, untouchable. In Asia, Ming emperors built massive filled with life-size statues, offerings, and ceremonial objects. The scale of these tombs is staggering, almost as if the rulers were attempting to carry the entire empire into the afterlife with them. Burial rituals, as social, mirrors these extravagant practices weren't just about death. They reflected the values, fears, and hierarchies of the society that built them. Elaborate tombs indicated wealth and power. Rituals ensured religious or political legitimacy. Curses reinforced authority beyond the grave. Even seemingly absurd elements, wax figures, multiple burial sites, or effigies that watched the living, were practical in their context. They preserved social order, reinforced status, and created continuity between past, present, and future. The most notorious cursed tombs, some royal burials, have earned a reputation that outlasts the rulers themselves. Tutankhamun, of course, is the poster child. Opened in 1922 by Howard Carter, the boy king's tomb seemed modest at first, yet it packed enough treasures to make even a seasoned archaeologist gasp. Soon after, several people involved in the excavation died unexpectedly. Was it a curse? Maybe, most likely, coincidence, exposure to mold, or simple misfortune. Still, the legend persists, a reminder that human imagination often lingers where facts end. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, offers another example. His tomb, massive and mysterious, was guarded by the famous terracotta army. Legends say rivers of mercury protected the emperor, making the site toxic for centuries. Whether the stories are true or exaggerated, the idea is clear. Even in death, the emperor controlled his domain, and anyone foolish enough to disturb it risked harm. In Europe, there are numerous tales of cursed nobles. Tombs in cathedrals or private chapels carried inscriptions warning intruders of divine vengeance. Some stories tell of grave robbers dying suddenly, of curses following families, or of misfortune striking anyone who dared disturb a royal resting place. In most cases, these tales are probably embellished, but they show the enduring human fascination with death, superstition, and posthumous influence. Why royal tombs fascinate. Royal burials captivate us because they combine three irresistible elements. Wealth and power. The dead monarch still impresses us with opulence. Fear of death. The rituals remind us that even kings cannot escape mortality. Mystery and superstition. Curses, secret chambers, and legends appeal to our imagination. We're drawn to stories of tombs and curses because they remind us of our own mortality. Our desire for legacy and our instinct to structure the unpredictable. Reflection, the quiet human obsession when we step back. It's clear that royal burials are really about humans coping with the inevitable. Wealth, status, and power may extend influence in life, but they cannot prevent death. Rituals, curses, effigies, and treasures are all attempts to negotiate with the unknown. Even the oddities, multiple burial sites, wax, effigies, and terrifying inscriptions make sense in context. They represent control, memory, and hope. And as night deepens, consider this. Across continents and millennia, royalty shared the same quiet human instincts that we do. They sought calm, order, and meaning in the face of the unknowable. They built structures, inscribed warnings, and performed rituals just as we create routines, say prayers, or carry lucky charms today. The lesson is simple, almost soothing. Power, wealth, and fear of death are universal. Ritual and preparation are timeless. And somewhere beneath layers of stone, wax, and legend, kings and queens rest quietly, their stories echoing softly through history. People who had all the power, all the money, and yet somehow managed to complicate their lives and each other's endlessly. Because even when you rule kingdoms, family can ruin everything. The Habsburgs, a cautionary tale in Start with the Habsburgs, probably the most famous example of dynastic disaster. They ruled vast swathes of Europe, yet their obsession with marrying cousins turned the family tree into something resembling a tangled vine. Take Charles II of Spain, who ruled in the late 17th century. He was called the Bewitched, not because of magic, but because decades of inbreeding had left him sickly, weak, and unable to produce an heir. His jaw was famously protruding, his body frail, and his mind often clouded. He had a long list of medical problems, many of which were likely inherited from centuries of carefully planned, genetically disastrous marriages. And yet, everyone kept marrying their cousins anyway, because keeping power in the family mattered more than health, apparently. The irony is sharp. A family obsessed with control ended up creating rulers who could barely control their own bodies. And when Charles II died without an heir, Europe erupted into war over succession, a final, tragic punctuation mark on a long line of mistakes. The Romanovs' tragedy, tyranny, and tea parties moving east to Russia. We encounter the Romanovs, a family famous for opulence, intrigue, and a touch of dysfunction. Tsar Nicholas II, the last emperor, ruled at the dawn of the 20th century. He had a large family, 4 daughters and 1 son. On paper, this sounds pleasant, a happy household of royalty. In reality, it was a powder keg. Alexei, the heir, suffered from hemophilia, a condition inherited from Queen Victoria through his mother, Alexandra. This meant minor injuries could be life-threatening. The parents became obsessed with doctors and mystics, including Rasputin, who somehow gained influence over state affairs because he helped Alexei. It's hard to imagine trusting your empire to a man with a questionable reputation, yet that's exactly what happened. Meanwhile, the daughters were famously pampered and sheltered, unaware of the growing unrest outside the palace walls. By 1917, the combination of personal illness, mystic influence, and political incompetence led to revolution. The entire family was executed, a tragic, dramatic, and utterly avoidable end to one of Europe's most storied dynasties. The Tudors, drama, execution, and inherited chaos across the English Channel. The Tudor family managed dysfunction with flair. Henry VIII, perhaps the most famous Tudor, had 6 wives, multiple illegitimate children, and a kingdom in constant emotional turmoil. Succession was messy, heirs died young, and marriages were frequently political disasters. Consider Edward VI, Henry's son, sickly from birth. He ruled briefly before dying at 15. His death triggered succession crises and power struggles, leaving England on the verge of chaos. Meanwhile, Mary I attempted to restore Catholicism, only to become infamous as Bloody Mary for her persecution of Protestants. Her half-sister, Elizabeth I, eventually stabilized the kingdom, but the family had already endured decades of intrigue, illness, and mismanagement. Dynastic marriages gone wrong one. Common thread in dysfunctional royal families is the obsession with political marriages. Cousins married cousins, heirs wed for alliances rather than love, and sometimes multiple generations suffered the consequences. The Habsburg jaw is perhaps the most famous physical example. Hemophilia in the Romanovs shows a tragic genetic consequence. Emotional trauma, political stress, and early deaths were all part of the package. In many cases, these marriages were meant to preserve power, but they often accelerated collapse. Families that should have been pillars of stability became frail, divided, and prone to scandal. Reflection: why royals couldn't get it. Right, it's tempting to imagine royalty as perfect, untouchable, and wise. In reality, they were just humans, with extreme responsibility, extreme wealth, and extreme family drama. Genetics doesn't care about crowns. Political marriages don't guarantee loyalty or happiness. Disease, superstition, and personality clashes can undo centuries of careful planning. And perhaps the most comforting thought is this: no matter how powerful someone was, family could always make life messy. Dynastic ambition might secure a throne, but it couldn't secure health, happiness, or even basic sanity. The Qing dynasty, court intrigue, and familial friction in China. The Qing dynasty ruled with strict hierarchy, Confucian principles, and an obsession with family order. And yet, dysfunction found its way into the Forbidden City. Take Emperor Qianlong. He ruled for decades, oversaw one of China's most prosperous periods, and adored ceremony. But his later years were marked by paranoia, overbearing control, and an inability to manage his sons. Qianlong's decision to retire in name only left his chosen successor, the Jiaqing Emperor, to navigate a web of court intrigue, eunuchs, and rival factions. Sons were pitted against each other, consorts maneuvered for influence, and the imperial court became a delicate game of survival. Even in a culture valuing order above all, family politics could unravel empires. The Ottoman sultans, sibling rivalries, and the cage of power, the Ottoman Empire, had a particularly unique approach to dynastic control. Fratricide. When a new sultan ascended, he often executed his brothers to prevent rebellion. This brutal practice ensured centralized power, but created a cycle of fear, mistrust, and psychological trauma within the royal family. Consider Sultan Mehmed III, who reportedly had 19 brothers executed upon accession. The palace became a place of quiet terror, princes hidden in secluded quarters, always aware that their survival depended on obedience, secrecy, and luck. This approach, while politically effective, produced generations of sultans raised in isolation, mistrustful of family, and sometimes mentally unstable. Power, in these cases, came at the cost of human connection, a recurring theme in dysfunctional dynasties. African kingdoms, dynastic strain and succession crises across Africa. Dynasties faced their own forms of internal chaos in the kingdom of Dahomey. Succession struggles often led to political purges within the royal household. Some Ethiopian emperors faced rebellions by relatives, sometimes violent, sometimes subtle, as ambitious family members schemed to claim the throne. Even when polygamy and extended families were used to solidify alliances, they often created rivalries among siblings and cousins. The larger the royal household, the more potential for jealousy, betrayal, and quiet sabotage. Tragic royal children in royal families often suffered the consequences of dynastic planning. Habsburg children inherited genetic disorders, fragile health, and the burden of expectation. Romanov children, especially Alexei, bore the weight of political instability and inherited disease. Tudor offspring faced dangerous succession games and the constant threat of death or exile. Even when parents were well-meaning, the combination of political ambition, inbreeding, and superstition often produced fragile, unhappy, or doomed heirs. It's easy to see these stories as tragedy, but in a quieter sense, they are human stories. Parents trying to secure the future, children caught in patterns they could never control. Sibling rivalries and court intrigues. Sibling rivalry is a recurring theme in royal families. Brothers plotted to overthrow each other. Sisters maneuvered for influence, sometimes marrying strategically to gain political advantage. Cousins became allies or enemies depending on the shifting winds of fortune. In some dynasties, these rivalries escalated into civil wars, assassinations, or exile. In others, they simmered quietly, a constant tension expressed in subtle gestures, secret letters, or whispered accusations in palace corridors. Reflection: why dynasties fail. The pattern is clear. Dynasties collapse not just from war or external pressure, but often from internal dysfunction. Overemphasis on power and bloodlines creates fragility. Political marriages sacrifice happiness for strategy. Siblings, children, and cousins inherit both status and the seeds of rivalry. Yet, despite centuries of evidence, dynasties continued these patterns. Perhaps because power, like sleep, is irresistible, or because human nature is consistent. Ambition, jealousy, love, fear, and hope exist in every royal court. European sibling rivalries, chaos behind the crown's Europe, unsurprisingly, offers some of the most dramatic examples of family dysfunction. The Bourbons of France. Louis XIV, the Sun King, had many children, both legitimate and illegitimate. Rivalries between his sons and grandsons simmered constantly. Despite careful arrangements for succession, the eventual mismanagement and extravagance of later kings contributed to social unrest and, ultimately, revolution. The Medici of Florence, wealthy, influential, and politically savvy, they were also prone to internal feuds. Marriages were strategic, yet cousins, siblings, and children often plotted behind one another's backs. Even when marriages strengthened, alliances, personal ambition, and jealousy could quietly undermine stability. The Plantagenets of England, known for their feuds, betrayals, and wars of succession. The rivalry between Richard III and his nephews, for example, is famous, tragic, and still debated today. Sibling disputes here weren't just personal, they shaped the entire nation's history. Absurdities in dynastic planning. Some dynastic strategies were less about logic and more about legacy, ego, or stubborn adherence to tradition, marrying cousins repeatedly, as the Habsburgs did, in the hope of keeping power pure, resulting instead in weak or ill heirs. Polygamy for political advantage, leading to vast households, complex rivalries, and endless intrigue, multiple burials and ceremonial overkill, aiming to preserve memory but often confusing successors or inviting unrest. It seems almost comical. From a distance, empires built on careful strategy, undone by family quirks and human frailty. And yet, it is deeply human. Power magnifies the same instincts, fears, and rivalries we all experience quietly in our own families. The weight of inherited trauma-dynastic disasters weren't just political. They were emotional and psychological. Children inherited illnesses, both genetic and environmental. Siblings inherited pressure, expectation, and competition. Successors inherited unresolved conflicts and precarious alliances. Generations of royals were trapped by their lineage, forced to navigate a delicate balance of obedience, ambition, and survival. Even those who appeared strong were shaped by centuries of inherited stress, superstition, and expectation. And in the quiet moments, when portraits stared down from palace walls and whispers of ancestors lingered in the halls, these royals were simply human, flawed, fragile, and often unhappy. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King and his obsessions, starting in France. Louis XIV, the Sun King, ruled for over 70 years, long enough to develop habits that seem obsessive and occasionally absurd. He reportedly bathed infrequently, relying on perfumes and powders to mask the inevitable. He required courtiers to adhere to strict routines, including precise attendance at his daily activities. From waking to dressing to dining, his obsession with appearances and ritual extended to his body. Nail care, hair arrangements, and layers of clothing were ceremonial in themselves. Even as the kingdom prospered, life at court revolved around his whims, rituals, and habits. It's easy to imagine the courtiers quietly plotting their next diversion while maintaining a polite smile. A delicate dance of obedience and survival. Peter the Great, sleep, work, and excess moving east. Peter the Great of Russia combined brilliance with eccentricity. He modernized Russia, but also imposed his vision obsessively, insisting that nobles adapt to Western customs. He reportedly worked tirelessly, often sleeping very little, drinking heavily, and conducting experiments in anatomy and shipbuilding personally. He had a fascination with European engineering, sometimes dragging his court along on uncomfortable expeditions just to inspect canals, docks, or fortifications. Peter's habits reflect a mix of genius and intensity, a ruler whose ambitions often overshadowed comfort, propriety, and perhaps sanity. Queen Elizabeth I. Rituals of control back in England. Elizabeth I managed her personal habits as carefully as her kingdom. She slept in short naps, often in public rooms with attendants nearby. She was meticulous about clothing, jewelry, and makeup, creating an image of eternal youth and authority. Her obsession with ritual extended to political theatre. Every gesture, word, and display was carefully calculated to maintain control. Elizabeth's habits remind us that for some royals, routine and ceremony were tools of governance, not just personal preference. Strange European indulgences. Some royals indulged in habits that seemed strange or even grotesque. Henry VIII reportedly enjoyed hunting and excessive feasts, contributing to his declining health later in life. Charles VI of France. Charles the Mad developed severe mental illness, alternating between paranoia, delusions, and ritualistic behaviors. Frederick the Great of Prussia had a fascination with philosophy and music, yet maintained obsessive control over military routines and personal schedule. These habits might appear quirky or excessive to modern eyes, but in context, they were expressions of authority, coping mechanisms, or personal obsessions magnified by power. Psychological patterns, eccentricity and isolation. A common theme emerges. Extreme power often produces unusual routines, obsessive attention to detail, compulsive rituals around health, appearance, or security, isolation from ordinary human experience, strange indulgences that outsiders find curious, alarming, or amusing. It's easy to mock these behaviors, but in truth, they reflect the pressures, fears, and responsibilities of ruling. After all, if every minor decision impacts millions of lives, eccentricity can be irrational, albeit extreme. Response: bizarre diets and eating habits. Many royals approached food as both indulgence and ritual, often in ways that seem excessive today. Henry VIII is the classic example. He loved feasts so much that his meals became legendary. Multiple courses, endless wine, and desserts piled high. His diet contributed to obesity, gout, and declining mobility, yet he continued to indulge, perhaps thinking royal indulgence could overcome mortality. Across Europe, other rulers practiced unusual dietary habits. Charles II of Spain reportedly suffered from digestive and metabolic issues, exacerbated by the limited and repetitive diet typical of Habsburg. In breeding traditions, Peter the Great had a taste for alcohol, especially strong spirits, which he sometimes consumed in astonishing quantities while working late into the night. French nobles often experimented with exotic ingredients, combining ingredients in ways modern palates might find unpleasant or even unappetizing. Food was not just nutrition, it was performance, status, and sometimes superstition. Obsessive personal rituals. Beyond food, many royals had strict, sometimes odd routines. Louis XIV, as mentioned, maintained elaborate daily rituals, rising, dressing, and dining with courtly observers, ensuring everyone witnessed the Sun King's every movement. Elizabeth I reportedly applied makeup meticulously every morning, both to hide signs of age and project authority. Frederick the Great of Prussia conducted meticulous inspections of military operations, personal gardens, and household arrangements, often obsessively repeating routines. These rituals were partly about control, over image, over court, and over life itself, but they also reveal the fragility and pressure inherent in absolute power. Eccentric hobbies and interests. Many royals pursued hobbies that could seem obsessive, strange, or trivial. King Charles VI of France, during bouts of madness, purportedly became convinced he was made of glass, handling objects with extreme care to avoid shattering. Ramses II of Egypt commissioned statues of himself so numerous that even in death, his image dominated public spaces. Peter the Great loved shipbuilding, anatomy experiments, and practical engineering, sometimes dragging his courtiers into uncomfortable experiments or inspections. These activities often served multiple purposes: personal interest, political signaling, and distraction from the pressures of rule. Yet, seen from the outside, they can appear whimsical, obsessive, or even absurd. Hygiene and health habits. Royalty had an interesting relationship with cleanliness. Louis XIV reportedly bathed infrequently, relying on perfumes and powders instead. Elizabeth I took short baths, applied scented oils, and carefully masked odors to maintain a refined image. Medieval and Renaissance rulers often used elaborate clothing, wigs, and cosmetics to obscure hygiene issues. In some cases, these habits were practical, given water quality or superstition. In others, they reflected vanity or ritualized attempts to maintain control over the body's image in the public eye. Psychological patterns, eccentricity and power, the combination of wealth, isolation, and responsibility seems to amplify eccentricity. Obsessive routines, strange dietary or hygiene practices, quirky hobbies, ritualized behavior to project control. These habits, though bizarre, were also survival strategies. They created predictability in lives where political and personal chaos were constant, and for rulers isolated by privilege. Oddities might be one of the few areas where they could assert absolute control. Extreme and peculiar habits. Some royals took eccentricity to levels that were almost performance art. Charles VI of France. Charles the Mad occasionally believed he was made of glass, carefully avoiding contact with objects to prevent shattering. It's a tragic, surreal image, a king encased in fear, moving through court like fragile porcelain, watched by attendants anxious not to cause calamity. Empress, Dowager Cixi of China, reportedly obsessed over opulent furnishings, extravagant jewelry, a meticulous ceremonial dress. She controlled court appearances and public rituals to ensure her image projected power, often ignoring practical governance in favor of elaborate spectacle. Queen Christina of Sweden preferred scholarly pursuits, philosophical debates, and collecting art over traditional female roles of her era. Her obsession with intellectual and cultural refinement made her both admired and controversial. A ruler whose habits defied convention in ways that are almost endearingly peculiar. Darkly humorous royal quirksome. Royal habits veer into the absurd or ironic. King George III of England purportedly walked in gardens wearing oversized cloaks and hats, using peculiar gestures to signal mood or intent. Louis XIV required servants to hold mirrors while he bathed, a ritual intended to assert control, but resulting in mild chaos and amusement for onlookers. Frederick the Great maintained strict military discipline, even in personal meals, turning ordinary activities into exercises in precision and control. These behaviors are almost humorous in hindsight, yet they reveal the same human need for order, ritual, and self-expression that we all experience, albeit in less conspicuous ways. We float gently into the quiet, sometimes tragic, often peculiar world of royal childhood, because even the tiniest heirs, surrounded by wealth and power, couldn't escape the peculiar pressures of palace life. And sometimes, those pressures created strange habits, illnesses, and isolation that echo quietly through history. Spoiled and shielded royal children were, unsurprisingly, spoiled, but not always in the way you might imagine. Louis XIV of France, for example, as a child was showered with attention, but only on very strict terms. His caretakers controlled every aspect of his day, meals, clothing, study, and even play, while he received the best tutors. He was rarely allowed unstructured time. The result, a child both indulged and rigidly trained, accustomed to constant attention but limited freedom in England. Elizabeth had a childhood filled with luxury, yet overshadowed by political tension. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, executed when Elizabeth was just 2. Elizabeth grew up under watchful eyes, taught the intricacies of politics, religion, and image from a very young age. Her playtime was carefully scheduled, her lessons rigorous, and her freedom extremely limited. Being spoiled in royal terms often meant access to everything, but with strings attached, creating children who were simultaneously pampered and isolated. Sickly heirs' health in royal families was a delicate balance, often affected by genetics, diet, and lifestyle. Charles II of Spain, as we discussed, suffered from decades of inbreeding, resulting in fragile health from birth. Alexei Romanov, son of Nicholas II and Alexandra, endured hemophilia, a genetic condition that made even minor injuries potentially fatal. Other royal children suffered from rickets, scurvy, smallpox, or poorly understood illnesses, often exacerbated by overprotective caretakers and diets heavy in sugar, wine, or overly rich foods. It wasn't uncommon for a sickly heir to be coddled excessively, swaddled, monitored constantly, or surrounded by a rotating cast of physicians. The result was childhood both protected and constrained, a quiet world of illness, instruction, and ritual rather than play and freedom. Isolation and courtly pressure isolation was a recurring theme. Habsburg children were sometimes kept apart from the outside world to preserve lineage and health, resulting in stunted social development. Tudor children, especially daughters, were raised under strict supervision, with lessons in politics, religion, and etiquette from dawn to dusk. Even in less extreme cases, royal children were constantly aware of their role as future rulers, heirs, or dynastic pawns. Play was often structured, friendships limited, and spontaneous exploration discouraged. The palace, while opulent, could feel like a gilded cage. Quirks and early habits, these pressures often led to strange behaviors or habits. Among young royals, obsessions with ritual or routine, learned from parents or tutors, early signs of eccentricity, magnified by isolation and intense observation, attachment to objects, animals, or personal items, providing comfort in a world of constant scrutiny. Even small quirks were magnified. A favorite toy, a peculiar sleeping habit, or a ritualized meal could become part of the child's personality and later, as adults, part of their royal eccentricity. Reflection. Childhood and power, the lives of royal children, remind us that even immense wealth and status cannot protect against human vulnerability. Spoiling does not equal freedom, does not ensure health. Luxury does not guarantee happiness. In fact, the pressures of expectation, duty, and visibility often intensified fragility. Yet, within these confines, children learned resilience, adaptability, and, sometimes, remarkable creativity. Royal childhood was a mix of indulgence, restriction, illness, and observation. A world apart from ordinary experience, quietly shaping the rulers of the future. Absolutely. Let's continue, Part 7. The secret lives of royal children, spoiled, sickly, and isolated. Diving into specific, tragic, or unusual stories, succession pressures, and their lasting impact on adult rulers, all in a calm, sleep-inducing tone. Tragic and unusual childhood stories. Some royal children had lives that were quietly tragic, even without war or execution looming. Prince Friedrich of Prussia, son of Frederick William I, grew up under a famously strict father who imposed harsh military drills and rigid routines. Friedrich preferred music, philosophy, and books. Pursuits deemed unworthy of a future. Soldier King. The conflict between personal inclination and paternal expectation caused long-term stress, shaping the ruler he eventually became. Marie Antoinette's children in France also illustrate the mixture of indulgence and fragility. Children were raised with tutors, governesses, and ceremonial obligations, yet health issues and the turbulence of court life made their early years precarious. The youngest, Sophie, died in infancy, quietly, a reminder of how even palaces could not shield children from the fragility of life. Edward VI of England suffered from illness and constant pressure from advisors and the court. Expected to act as a competent monarch at a very young age, surrounded by power struggles, he absorbed adult responsibility far too early. His early death, at 15, abruptly ended his brief reign, leaving England in uncertainty and succession turmoil. The quiet weight of succession created a shadow over childhood. Every action, every habit, every illness was scrutinized for political impact. Playtime and personal expression were often subordinated to preparation for leadership. Even minor illness could trigger anxiety, as heirs were expected to survive and carry the dynasty forward. This pressure created a recurring pattern across dynasties. Children grew up highly aware of mortality, responsibility, and family expectation long before they were ready. Childhood, for royalty, was a delicate balance between preparation and preservation. Strange comforts and coping mechanisms. Some children developed unique ways to cope with their constrained lives. Attachment to pets. Royal children often formed bonds with animals, which provided companionship outside the rigid social hierarchy. Secret collections, books, small toys, or personal items offered solace and a sense of ownership. Private rituals, small routines for comfort, a way to control a world that was otherwise dictated by tutors, parents, and advisors. These habits often carried into adulthood, sometimes influencing the eccentricities or obsessions of rulers. It's a gentle reminder that quirks and coping strategies have deep roots, shaped long before crowns and power were involved. Extreme childhood, tragedies. Some royal children experienced quiet tragedies that were both personal and dynastic. Prince John of the United Kingdom, youngest son of George, 5, suffered from epilepsy and other health challenges, largely kept out of public view, living a secluded life within the palace. Despite the love of his family, his childhood was marked by isolation and careful monitoring, a small tragedy hidden from public eyes. Louis XVII of France, imprisoned during the Revolution at just 8 years old, lived under harsh conditions, deprived of proper care, and eventually died in captivity at 10. His story is a stark reminder that wealth and royalty could not always protect children from the tides of history. Alexei Romanov, as previously mentioned, bore the weight of hemophilia in a politically unstable environment. Every small injury was a potential crisis. His parents' reliance on mystics like Rasputin shaped his limited childhood, blending care with superstition. These stories are quieter than wars or executions, but carry their own weight, illustrating the fragility of life, even among the privileged. Eccentric childhood habits, cessation, observation, and pressure often led to unique or peculiar habits, collecting miniature objects or dolls, sometimes with obsessive attention to detail, secret gardens or hidden play areas, offering private spaces in otherwise public lives. early intellectual pursuits, encouraged for political preparation, but often pursued passionately for personal satisfaction. Even seemingly small quirks were amplified by palace life, forming the foundation of adult eccentricities or rituals. Play, comfort, and curiosity became acts of quiet rebellion and self-preservation. Tonight, we drift into the quiet, complicated, and sometimes absurd world of royal marriages. Because power, politics, and wealth don't always make for happy unions. In fact, they often make them downright bizarre. And yet, in these relationships, we find subtle drama, quiet tension, and, occasionally, human glimpses behind the crowns. Political marriages, duty before love in most dynasties. Marriage was less about affection and more about strategy. Habsburg marriages famously prioritized bloodlines, producing both strong alliances and, unfortunately, genetic complications. Tudor alliances were arranged to cement international ties, often at the expense of personal compatibility or happiness. French royal unions sometimes paired opposites in temperament, wealth, or health, creating quiet domestic tension. These marriages illustrate a simple truth. In royalty, personal desire is often secondary to dynastic ambition. Children, inheritance, and alliances mattered far more than love or companionship. Famous dysfunctional couples, Henry VIII and his 6 wives. Perhaps the most famous example of marital dysfunction in history, his marriages spanned political convenience, personal obsession, and occasional brutality. Wives were executed, divorced, or neglected, while Henry's whims ruled domestic life. Yet, the court ritualized each union, maintaining appearances while chaos unfolded quietly behind the walls. Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI. Their marriage was politically motivated, uniting Austria and France. Louis XVI was shy, indecisive, and uninterested in public display. Marie Antoinette was lively, ambitious, and scrutinized endlessly by court and public alike. Together, they represented a classic mismatch. Affection limited, understanding uneven, and public pressure immense. Peter the Great and Catherine I. Initially a servant and companion, Catherine rose to rule Russia after Peter's death. Their marriage was unconventional, based on personal loyalty and shared ambition, yet the relationship defied traditional expectations, illustrating how affection, political alliance, and personal eccentricity could intertwine. Quiet absurdities in royal marriage. Not all dysfunction was dramatic. Some was subtle, absurd, and gently humorous. Strict routines and rituals. Some couples barely spoke outside public appearances, yet followed elaborate daily protocols. Jealousy and secrecy. Even minor disagreements could spiral into elaborate precautions or court intrigues, bizarre hobbies or obsessions. One spouse's obsession with furniture, animals, or ceremonial rituals could dominate domestic life. These habits may seem odd, but they highlight the isolation and pressure of royal life. Even mundane personal quirks were magnified by wealth, visibility, and expectation. Inheritance of dysfunction. Many royal children inherited the consequences of marital dynamics. Observing parents' conflicts or distance-shaped personality and expectations. Children internalized pressure. Secrecy or obsession as normal in some cases. Dysfunction became a family pattern, quietly passed from generation to generation. This cyclical nature reminds us that even dynasties cannot escape the human cost of relationship strain. Power magnifies human behavior, for better or worse, and marital dysfunction often ripples across generations. Reflection, marriage, power, and human nature. The pattern is subtle but persistent. Marriage in royalty is rarely about affection alone. Politics, survival, and appearances dominate. Eccentricity, pressure, and secrecy shape the domestic sphere. Yet, within these constraints, occasional affection, shared ambition, or mutual eccentricity could create surprising stability. Royal couples were human, flawed, and constrained, navigating an intricate dance of duty, expectation, and personal desire. We drift into a world of choices, quiet, sometimes absurd, sometimes quietly tragic, made by those who ruled vast kingdoms and empires. Because even absolute power doesn't guarantee wisdom, and history quietly remembers the consequences. Ill-advised policies. Some of the most fascinating historical choices were not battles or wars, but domestic and political policies imposed by rulers with the best intentions or the oddest whims. Peter the Great's beard tax, in an effort to modernize Russia along European lines. Peter taxed facial hair. Nobles who refused to shave had to pay a fine, and the beard became both a social and political statement. It seemed small, but the tax symbolized the tension between tradition and reform, and perhaps Peter's quiet obsession with control. Louis XIV and the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, a major policy aimed at religious uniformity, forcing Huguenots to convert or flee. The decision weakened France economically and socially, as many skilled workers emigrated here. Personal belief and desire for control had long-term consequences for millions. Frederick the Great of Prussia's military obsession focused almost entirely on army discipline and precision, sometimes neglecting broader economic or cultural policy. While his domestic decisions occasionally stifled innovation and growth. These decisions highlight the quiet tension between ruler ambition, personal interest, and unintended consequences. Domestic whims with consequences. Some royal decisions were personal rather than political. Eccentricities that left lasting effects. Henry VIII's constant reshaping of marriage and succession. Each marriage had domestic and political ripple effects. From executed queens to disputed heirs, estates were rearranged, titles reassigned, and laws amended, all to fit personal desire or political necessity. Empress Dowager, Cixie's lavish spending, preferred elaborate palaces, jewelry, and ceremonies over investment in state infrastructure at times, while her reign maintained stability. Some decisions contributed to inefficiency and unrest later. Charles VI of France's obsessive routines. His mental health issues led to public proclamations and erratic rule. Ministers and advisors struggled to maintain normal governance while honoring his rituals and delusions. Even when personal, these choices often shaped the broader political and social landscape quietly but irrevocably. The quietly tragic decisions, some royal decisions, resulted in understated tragedy. Louis XVII imprisoned and starved during the French Revolution. As his family's position collapsed, Alexei Romanov's hemophilia, exacerbated by reliance on Rasputin and secrecy, ultimately contributed to political instability. Habsburg insistence on inbreeding, leading to generations of fragile heirs and ill-fated marriages. These are decisions that may have seemed minor or personal at the time, but carried ripple effects across families, kingdoms, and centuries. reflection, power, choice, and human fallibility, the pattern emerges. Even the mighty are human, prone to whim, obsession, or error. Decisions often mix personal desire, perceived duty, and eccentricity. Consequences, however, extend quietly far beyond the palace walls, affecting families, nations, and future generations. History is full of such subtle echoes, where a small personal choice quietly shifts the course of many lives. And perhaps that is comforting. It reminds us that power magnifies human nature, but also that every choice carries weight. Tonight, we drift gently into the final chapters of these royal lives, because even the most powerful, eccentric, or tragic rulers eventually face the same quiet inevitability as the rest of us: the end of life, reflection, and legacy. And sometimes, the way they leave the stage is as revealing as their most eccentric behaviors. Gentle decline and final years. Many rulers spent their final years in relative quiet, even if their earlier lives were tumultuous. Louis XIV of France, after decades of pomp, ritual, and control, the Sun King's final years were marked by pain and illness. Arthritis and other ailments limited his mobility, yet he maintained ceremonial appearances until the very end. He died in 1715, surrounded by advisors and courtiers who had spent lifetimes in his shadow. Peter the Great of Russia, his relentless energy eventually gave way to exhaustion and illness. He remained involved in state affairs almost until his final moments, embodying both dedication and obsession. His death left Russia deeply shaped by his reforms, rituals, and personal eccentricities. Elizabeth I of England, the Virgin Queen, ended her reign in relative solitude, her careful image maintained until her death. The pressures of rule, combined with decades of personal discipline, left her both revered and isolated, even for rulers who lived extravagantly or The final years often involved reflection, illness, and quiet preparation for the inevitable. Quiet legacies. The end of life often reveals a ruler's true legacy. Beyond monuments or political victories, patterns of eccentricity, small quirks and habits can become defining characteristics in historical memory. Influence on successors, decisions, routines, and obsessions often shaped heirs and governance long after death. Humanization, seeing rulers in decline, reminds us that, despite power and wealth, they faced universal vulnerabilities. For instance, the personal quirks of Louis XIV, obsessive routines, love of ceremony, careful grooming, shaped French court culture for generations. Similarly, Peter the Great's obsessive modernization shaped Russian identity long after his death. Final absurdities in decline. Eccentricity persisted quietly. Charles VI of France, whose delusions had shaped decades, continued rituals in private chambers, attended by cautious courtiers. Empress Dowager Cixi maintained her obsession with ceremonial display until her final days. Henry VIII, though diminished by age and illness, continued to influence succession and domestic arrangements with a commanding presence. These final habits are almost tender in their absurdity, echoes of lives lived in extreme intensity, slowly tapering toward human fragility. Reflection. The quiet end of power as we consider the endings of these rulers. Several themes emerge. Eccentricity, obsession, and ritual often persisted until the very end. Illness, age, and isolation humbled even the most powerful. The subtle, personal details, habits, quirks, small indulgences, sometimes outlive political achievements in the historical imagination. In the end, all crowns are temporary, all palaces silent, and all rituals eventually end. History preserves memory, often in subtle, quiet ways, a legacy of human vulnerability, curiosity, and the persistent, sometimes amusing, sometimes tragic, patterns of personality.